So happy Palm Sunday. How many of you honestly have no clue really what Palm Sunday's about? How many of you sort of think you know what Palm Sunday's about? How many of you chose not to vote? You know, every year when this time of year comes around, I do a lot of prayer and reading and preparation, and every year it's as if the Easter and the Palm Sunday reveal new messages. And so this Sunday is very much a time of preparation for what we will experience next week. And one thing that I absolutely know for sure about Palm Sunday, as well as Easter, but certainly the time we call Palm Sunday, is it has to do with a message that was seeking to be expressed, but really was completely misunderstood. Now, we all know what that's like. Can you think of some ridiculous example of maybe when you had a conversation with somebody and you talked for a long time and then realized you were talking about two completely different things? You were just not on the same page. Well, to illustrate that point, there's a story of Tim and Tina, a couple who had been married for a number of years and were getting ready to celebrate their 20th anniversary, and so they had talked about it and planned it, and yet totally miscommunicated because they knew they were taking a trip to Jamaica, but they both got the dates wrong. And so when it came time to go, they really had a difficult time manipulating their schedules so they could go together, and they couldn't even go at exactly the same time on their 20th anniversary. So you can imagine how Tim and especially Tina felt about that. So Tim flew into Jamaica one day, and Tina was supposed to arrive the next day. And after Tim arrives, he sends an email to his wife, who's still at home and will arrive the next day. But there was a little problem. He accidentally sent the email to Brandy. Now, Brandy was just getting home from a really difficult day because she was just coming home from the funeral of her ex-husband. And as Brandy comes in and receives this text, this is what Brandy heard. My dear faraway wife, I'm sorry there was tension between us before we left, but I wanted to let you know that I arrived safely. I miss you, and I'm looking forward to having you join me tomorrow. By the way, be prepared, it's much hotter here than expected. A funny but an extreme example of what can happen when we get our wires crossed or when the message that we've intended somehow shows up somewhere else. Well, to delve into the message, the meaning of Palm Sunday, requires us to really look at the life and the teachings of the man that was known and that we know as Jesus. And in Unity, of course, I am so excited that we offer a unique perspective on who Jesus was and what he represented and the gift that he really brought. And all of that, you don't put that aside, but in order to really get Easter and Palm Sunday, you have to go back and recreate the historical context as much as possible. And so that's what I want to do for the first part of our time together this morning, and then we'll be able to glean what value is possibly offered to us. So during the time that we know as Palm Sunday, it certainly wasn't called Palm Sunday then, but there was a big celebration going on in Jerusalem, and it was called the Passover. And so the Passover was the biggest celebration for the Jews who had been the children of Israel. Remember Moses and the children of Israel and how they went through the wilderness? Well, this group of Jewish people were now a huge nation. And yet they were estranged from their home. They were oppressed by the Roman government. They weren't living near their temple. And this sacred holiday was one of the 3 times of year, and this was the number one time when all the Jewish people made the trek into Jerusalem to go to their temple to honor in the way that they needed to honor. As a matter of fact, every male Jew was required to go. And so what history says is in Jerusalem, where there normally would have been about 50,000 people, there were over 150,000 people. And so you can imagine the Roman government was really kind of upset about that. The tension was high. There was a lot of political unrest and a lot of religious unrest, because you've got all of these people who are really wanting to be their own nation flocking in at the same time together. There's a lot of tension. And so right around this time, Jesus decides to make the most public demonstration that he ever made. Now, this is at the height of his ministry. We know it's towards the very end of, historically we can see that Jesus taught for about 3 years publicly. And yet when we say he taught publicly, most of the time it was on the bank of a river, or he never went and tried to be on the big platform. It was always sort of an obscure place, and signs and miracles were happening, and he had a radical message. His message really flew in the face of the religious leaders of that time, because his message said, what if the temple is inside of you and you don't need that temple? Well, they made a lot of money off the temples and the priest. And he said, what if you don't need a priest? What if you can go direct to God? And so he was espousing some teachings that the common people really liked. They didn't understand, but they were intrigued. But the religious leaders were very upset, and the political leaders were very upset. So he knew that he had kind of was in a hot spot. He'd been doing this for about 3 years, and it was very clear that the leaders, both religious leaders and political leaders, were just waiting for him to make a mistake so they could have a legitimate reason to get rid of him. So when you know you're under that kind of scrutiny and there's that sort of tension in Jerusalem, the fact that he picked that point in time to go right straight in and deliver a message tells us just that. He was absolutely seeking to make a point, to deliver a point, to make a public demonstration. Marcus Borg says, the popularity of Jesus had been growing. Those around him were impressed with his miracles, his signs and wonders. They were intrigued by his teachings, which seemed to bypass the need for priests as intercessors. He rebuked the money changers in the temple who acted as if God's blessing must be purchased with money or sacrifice, and he made the presence and blessings of God accessible and available to everyone. He had the attention of everyone. And so when he rides into Jerusalem, he does so in a very unorthodox fashion. Because the other thing that the people there are expecting, they wanted a king, they wanted a savior, they wanted a deliverer, but not the kind that you and I have been accustomed to think. Anyone in that particular time, it was clear that the Jews of that time wanted a savior, they wanted a king, they wanted a deliverer. But what they were looking for was a political, a military deliverer, someone who would reestablish them with their own kingdom. Now, does it sound familiar that we've still got all this fighting taking place in Jerusalem over 2,000 years later? It's the exact same time of thing that was going on. Now, the reason we have more evidence is they welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem with the waving of palm fronds. Now, most of us have been told that palms are a symbol of peace. And in one sense they are. But what we fail to realize, because we don't really understand that culture, is that palms were the symbol of Jewish nationalism. It was the picture that was on their coin. And so when they begin to wave the palms and throw those down, and they begin to shout Hosanna, which literally means save us now. It says they'd seen the power that Jesus had demonstrated, and they believed that he was the person who would take them out of bondage of the Romans and would make them a royal nation again. They were hoping it was going to happen right then and right there that day. So the crowd is sort of getting incited about this. And yet there's one thing that is absolutely totally bizarre. Now, anyone who would have positioned him or himself to be a leader would have charged in the town riding on a stallion. That's what warriors rode. Jesus was very particular. Before he rode in, he had his disciples go and get something. What was it? A donkey. And not just any old donkey. He told them where they could go find one that was a baby and that was pure and that had never been ridden on. It was just the purest little donkey you could find. But it would be kind of embarrassing if we're like all cheering. We want our new president or whoever it's going to be, and they show up and they're driving in a golf cart.